The 1920 Olympics had come and gone without their inclusion, and the IOC confirmed that 1924 would follow suit. After all, running, jumping, and throwing were not only unladylike activities, but participating in them could be downright dangerous for a woman. Too much strain, and she may not be able to bear children, which, after all, is her main role on Earth. So, really, the exclusion was for women's own protection. Gotta protect the poor, fragile women. But just as we roll our eyes at this narrative today, so too did the women of the early 20th century. And so rather than accept their fate as being confined to less strenuous activities within the confines of their own homes, they decided instead to organize their own version of the Olympics. Today is Wednesday, August 20th, 2025, and on this day in 1922, 77 female athletes competed at the first ever Women's World Games in Paris. In this episode, we'll learn about Alice Milliat, who spearheaded the fight for inclusion of women's track and field events in the early 1900s, hear what the first women's track meet in 1922 looked like, and discuss the role played by the Women's World Games in the IOC's eventual capitulation 6 years later. I'm your host, Running Up That Hillary, and you are listening to Today in Running History. Alice Milliat was born in France in 1884 and from an early age showed an interest in sports and great athletic ability. However, there were not many avenues open to her in that arena, and so she took the traditional route of marrying in 1904. She was widowed only 4 years later, but rather than remarrying quickly, as many women did in those days following the death of their spouse, Milliat instead began traveling and participating in sports. She took up rowing, swimming, soccer, cycling, and field hockey. Meanwhile, her countryman and the so-called father of the modern Olympics, Pierre de Coubertin, said in 1912 that having women in the Olympics was, and I quote, impractical, uninteresting, ungainly, and I do not hesitate to add improper. Milliat disagreed. In 1917, she helped form the French Women's Sporting Foundation and took over as its president in 1919. By that point, everything had been set in stone for the upcoming 1920 Olympics in Antwerp, Belgium, and so Milliat turned her focus toward advocating for women's track and field inclusion in the 1924 Games, which were to be held in her home country instead. When Milliat approached the IAAF, which was the precursor to today's World Athletics, about getting women's track and field competitions added to the slate of the 1924 Olympics, her request was denied. Instead of giving up, she expanded the Women's Sporting Federation internationally and decided to hold the first ever Women's World Games in 1922 instead. In the spring of 1921, they held a smaller scale trial event in Monaco called the Women's Olympiad. There were running events, but no actual running track, so they instead competed in a field traditionally used for shooting pigeons. No one took record keeping very seriously at the 1921 Women's Olympiad, so no full list of athletes and results has survived. The event also included non-track events like basketball, swimming, and gymnastics. The first Women's Olympiad successfully showcased women's sports, but Alice Milliat wanted more. She wanted something bigger, something that truly rivaled the Olympics, something that would garner international attention. And so she decided to organize the first ever Women's World Games, an international women-only track and field competition held exactly 103 years ago today. Like the Women's Olympiad the year before, the Women's World Games included multiple European athletes. But this time, 13 women from the United States traveled across the Atlantic to compete as well. Now let's talk about what the Women's World Games actually looked like. There were 11 events, all held within that single day of competition on August 20th, 1922. Instead of taking place in a pigeon shooting field, they had an actual stadium with a track and 20,000 spectators. The stadium in Belgium that had hosted the Olympics just 2 years earlier only seated 12,000 people at one time, so the female athletes competing in Paris in 1922 experienced crowds nearly twice as big. Of course, the Antwerp Olympics were held over the course of 4 weeks, so more people in total showed up to watch them than they did for the Women's World Games. But at any given time, the crowds themselves were actually larger for the Women's Games. Now, let's talk a bit about the events at the Women's World Games, because many of these were way ahead of their time. For example, they had a 1,000-meter race, and it took the actual Olympics until 1972 to have a race that long offered for women. On the field side, women could also compete in the long jump and shot put, both of which wouldn't be added to the Olympics until 1948. And it wasn't just that these events were offered. This event basically wrote the record book. 18 world records were set at this track meet, which is impressive regardless of context, but many of these were the first time that women had even been formally measured or recorded at all. And it's important to note that even though these are now considered world records, at the time the IAAF did not recognize any records by women, so they were instead referred to as world's bests. Here are a few of these standout stars from that August day in 1922 and the world records that they set. Camille Saby was a teenager from New Jersey who won the gold in the 100-yard hurdles and the standing long jump, setting new world records in both. Mary Lines from the UK won the gold in the 300 meters long jump and 4x100-yard relay, with world records in the long jump and relay. Lucy Breard from France won the 1,000 meters in a new world record, and Francesca Pianzola of Switzerland won the javelin in yet another new world record. Overall, the Women's World Games in 1922 were a huge milestone for women's sports, although they did not receive widespread attention at the time, nor are they really common knowledge today. They were held for a second time in 1926, this time in Gothenburg, Sweden, and by the 1928 Olympics in Amsterdam, the IOC finally decided to allow women to compete in a handful of track and field events. Because the 1928 Olympics only offered 5 of those events for women, the International Women's Sports Federation decided to host a third and fourth Women's World Games in 1930 and 1934. Finally, in the mid-1930s, the IOC and IAAF proposed a compromise that would recognize all records set at the Women's World Games and expand the program of women's track and field events at future Olympics, as long as the International Women's Sport Federation agreed to cancel the 1938 Women's World Games that had been slated for Vienna. They would also allow women to compete in the 1938 European Championships. And while no formal agreement was actually ever agreed upon, there was never another Women's World Games held. Women did, in fact, compete in those championships in 38, and the International Women's Sports Federation was dissolved that same year. I think at that point, everyone was hopeful that these compromises would lead to more opportunities for women at the 1940 and 1944 Olympics, but both were ultimately canceled for everyone due to World War II. However, when they picked back up in 1948, 3 more events were offered for women, which was a start. And what happened to the athletes of the Women's World Games? Well, most of them lived long and very full lives. American Camille Saby returned to Newark to a hero's welcome and parade of over 1,000 people. She taught PE for 35 years, had a daughter at the age of 44, and lived to be 95 years old. Brit Mary Lines, who won triple gold at the Women's World Games in 1922, went on to win 8 national championships in the long jump and various running events before retiring and lived to be 85. Czech Marie Meslikova broke her own 100-meter world record, then set a world record in the 4x100 meters with 3 other women, all named Marie, one of whom shared her last name as well. She lived to be 91. Lucy Breard from France won multiple French cross-country titles in the 1920s and lived to be 85. And Swiss javelin thrower Francesca Pianzola went on to found the first documented women's soccer team in Switzerland. She was born in 1897, and since I cannot find a death date for her online, I like to think that she is living her best life somewhere in the Alps at the age of 128. And what about Alice Milliat, who organized the Women's World Games and played a huge part in getting women's track and field events added to the Olympic slate? In 1928, she served as the only female judge of the athletics events at the Amsterdam Olympics. Following the final Women's World Games in 1934, Milliat shifted her focus onto women's suffrage in France, which finally became a reality 10 years later. Alice Milliat died in 1957 at the age of 73, fading into obscurity for nearly 60 years. But in 2016, the Alice Milliat Foundation was established, making it the first European foundation specifically focused on the exposure and promotion of women's sports. In 2021, a statue of Alice Milliat was erected at the House of Sport in Paris. At the dedication ceremony, the IOC president remarked that Milliat would have been proud that the 2024 Olympics in Paris would be the first in history with perfect gender equality. And I am inclined to believe that he was right. That's the show for you today. Thank you all so much for listening. Please make sure to like, subscribe, comment, share, turn on alerts, give me a good rating, and then send this episode to all the badass female athletes that you know. And then join me tomorrow for a story of redemption about Mary Decker Slaney, who did so much more in her career than just fall at the 1984 Olympics like we talked about on August 10th. I'm your host, Running Up That Hillary, and this has been Today in Running History. Okay, apparently I wasn't recording any of that. And also, yeah, so I don't know if any of that got recorded and I pushed the button or anything, but none of that counts. So I'm just gonna start again. And I did a pretty damn good job too, but that's okay. Said in 19, not in a, okay. Did I actually push record this time? Okay, I did. Marie Mezhlikova. Okay. Mezhlikova. I'm just going to ignore the J and just hope that's silent. Like in Czechoslovakia. Okay. Served as the only female member judge of the... No, female judge. What was it? What the hell's a member judge?